And there's a whole science emerging of the electromagnetic field that humans put off, and we know now that your electromagnetic field extends about 5 yards around your body all the time, and this explains that phenomenon that all of us have faced when somebody who's in a really good mood can come into a room and all of a sudden you just feel a little bit better. And it's because their heart rate is calm and their neurotransmitters are all lined up with good things, and they influence your electromagnetic field, and it's physics that influences you positively. But that's the same problem when somebody's that's really mad or angry or in an obviously bad attitude walks into a room, and they call them Debbie Downers in the United States. That somebody walks in and just has a really bad attitude, and everybody feels worse, and no words have been exchanged yet, right? And it's because if that person's field is way off, then it affects your heart rate, it affects your brain chemistry, it affects your whole spirit. And so I think being aware that our presence has an impact on other people's physiology and their neurochemistry is important. And it's really true. It's been well studied now. They've even done some studies where they have people in different rooms that don't know about each other's presence. And they're measuring heart rate and all of these things, physiological parameters, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate. And they ask one person to be in a really bad mood and be grumpy, and it'll affect the heart rate of a person in another room that doesn't know that person's there. And so we definitely have an impact on the people around us, and that puts a responsibility on us, really. Like if you're going to interact with somebody who's hurting, you can make it worse by just not being in a pleasant space, and you're in your own mind with them. So get your emotional state in check and try to minister to people even if no words are spoken.
Hi, I believe sharing is caring. I recently took a tumble down the stairs and hurt a knee with a historic injury. As a consequence, I started using the ATG app to rehabilitate my knee. Since using the ATG app, I'm now able to walk relatively pain-free. I'm not getting any younger, and this knee injury was a lesson that I need to prioritize my physical health and fitness. The ATG app gives you affordable personal training and a coach to help you correct your form on a range of pain-free exercises that build your body from the ground up. ATG's mission is to help the broken to bulletproof their knees and help every person suffering from any degree of knee pain. The founder, Ben Patrick, says he wants to give people back their lives and the ability to play with their children and grandchildren, to give back hope and a renewed invigoration for life. Join me in training on the ATG app. Click on the link to get $20 off the first time and type in code SOPHIA to get a discount on a range of ATG equipment. Hi, Dr. Lee.
Hi,
Welcome to
Sophia.
Ideology. Welcome to Ideology Podcast.
Thank you.
So I am so honored to have you on. I honestly been reading all three books, and just I'm gonna try and not get too emotional, but I found, obviously your story is so powerful. So let's see, where should we start? I think we're in dire need of hope. So let's start with your latest book, which is Hope is the First Dose, a treatment plan for recovering from trauma, tragedy, and other massive things. Right now, actually, in the UK, there is a news story that broke out yesterday, and it has gripped all of London, really. It's the leading news story. It's a young girl whose mother was a nurse, had her daughter intervened and intervened in a fight with a friend, and then ended up stabbed. And so we're all, just really shocked and dealing with this news story, which just seems like such a tragedy. So this interview couldn't come at a more pressing time for us. So can we start with, first of all, you say that you are you're a neurosurgeon, but that you're
Yes.
also a person of faith. And to most people, that will sound like an oxymoron. What are the challenges that you have faced in trying to reconcile, your science mind, logical, fact driven, and also being a person of faith?
Yeah, so I actually don't find a conflict at all there. If you go far enough back in science, in the history of science, the original scientists were people who were trying to explain the things that they thought God had done. So, how do we look at nature and explain all these things that God has done? And as time has passed, science became sort of co opted as this way of looking at the world and trying to explain it on natural terms. And so, naturalism and materialism were the branches of science that came up to say, let's talk about everything with just what we can explain based on what we can see and what we can test. And so somehow over time, that notion came to sort of exclude the idea of there being a God altogether. And people were taught, especially in school, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the United States, we're almost taught you need to leave your faith at the door and we're going to talk about science and things we can test, and they're exclusive to one another. But it turns out that's really not true. If you hit something really hard in your life,
Yes.
I've been to war and I've been bombed and I've been mortared and I've seen all the worst things people can do to each other. And then I've, been through some personal struggles, including losing a child, as I'm sure we'll talk about. And what happens is when you hit those really hard times, you don't find yourself looking to a science book for answers. You find yourself crying out to God or the universe or whatever your belief system is. You recognize that you need some help, and that help is not easily found in the things that you can touch and feel in the world around you oftentimes. So the old saying, there's no atheists in foxholes, when the stress is really on, I think most of us in our deepest parts turn to some place to look for answers. And for me, I've always been able to reconcile that those answers are out there, and science seems to catch up slowly but surely over time with things that may seem to be more metaphysical or spiritual.
That's really nice to hear, actually. But do you think that people who have never been introduced to faith or religious belief or any form of spiritual teachings can also learn to develop a sense of faith in a transcendent or God, or how can they do the same?
Yeah, I think what I would say is if the things that you have done in your life leave you with a sense of wanting or desire to need something more, if the problem that you're facing has left you saying, gosh, the things that I typically do to find solace or answers don't seem to be working. If you find yourself there, then I
Mm.
would say just cry out and say, God, if you're really out there, then find some way to show me that there's some hope. And so for me, in the worst moments, when my son died, for example, I began seriously questioning the things I always believed, because we have this notion of wanting to say, if there's really a loving God, then this X, Y, or Z couldn't happen, or God wouldn't allow this thing to happen. And what you learn is you need to find the ability to let God nurture and minister to you in those dark times. And the understanding comes later of how some of these evil things can happen in an evil universe. And the hope is that we get to be someday in a place and a time when these evil things will no longer occur. And so I think if you're in a place where you don't have that background or faith or underpinning of belief, then just look at how your life is working. And if it seems to not be working, then maybe just give God a chance. Maybe give faith a chance and see if all of a sudden you start finding some hope building up in your soul as you seek those sort of more profound answers that they will come. I found that God never hides from people who earnestly seek him.
Mm. I believe the same, but it's only in the last few years that I've come to know people who profess or say that they've never actually had any religious teachings and so don't believe in God as a consequence. And so it's only, I grew up in Africa and I'd never met anybody who didn't believe in God. You are either Christian or you're Muslim or you're,
Right.
you believe in something. And it's only, I think, in the last, I would say, 2 decades that I have come to see that I need to also think what must it feel like and how how does someone who doesn't believe also have hope? But it's really powerful what you're saying. You say that there's a difference. You say that dogmatic belief is not life sustaining. What's the difference between faith and dogmatic belief?
So I think that's another place where we disconnect, right? So you can have things that people teach as religious teachings and find that there's no life in them. So the rules and that's what I think a lot of people sort of almost convict God for things that people do, right? So you have religions and systems and politics and things that build up around ideas, and people don't perfectly implement even the best ideas or the best plans, right? So if God, for example, has a plan and people on earth don't carry it out properly, then other people who are seeking answers may see these people failing to do the things that maybe God even wants them to do, and they judge the entire system based on the inability of the people to carry it out properly. So what I would say is always go back to what is God actually saying to me? What does the scripture say, or what is the spirit actually want me to know, and where is that power and hope? And not just look at people, because all of us are broken in different ways, and none of us are perfect or able to carry out everything even we say we believe in our own lives all the time. And so I would say if you're struggling because you've seen other people have dogmatic beliefs, or not being able to even keep the rules that they set for themselves and set for you, maybe it's not the rules, or maybe it's not the doctrine that's the problem. Maybe it's the people. And so let's look past that and try to find the hope. Scientists have long looked at hope, Sophia, and said, what is it that gives people hope outside of a religious context altogether? There's a lot of research on how people can find hope even if they don't have a spiritual element. And the most consistent thing that shows up in the scientific research of what separates a hopeless person from a hopeful one is this sort of general ability to say, I think I can get there from here. Like to have this sort of agency, this ability to look at a problem or look at some place that you're in and say, gosh, I've been through some hard things before and somehow I managed to make it through them. And so maybe I'll be able to get there from here again. And so if you can have that sort of general sense that this particular problem that you're going through doesn't have to be the end, because other people have navigated similar problems, because you've navigated something hard before in your past, that maybe you can again. And what I find is when you start looking for that hope in whatever the situation is, I start feeling something in my spirit that's bigger than I can explain out of my own rational mind. And I think that's where God shows up and he says, hey, this is a big problem and you don't have to do it alone. I'm going to help you get through it if you're willing to just take my hand and let me help you. And that was really ministering to me in the hours and days and months after we lost our son. And there's a Psalm 34:18 that says the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. And what I would find is in those moments when I was just desperately broken, is that I would feel the presence, that sort of spirit there with me that says you're not alone. And I think a lot of people can seek that, and it turns out to be really incredibly hope generating when you seek that presence when you're alone and it feels like everything's falling in around you, that he'll show up.
Hmm. Just reading your book, Hope is the First Dose, you talk about how you have 5 children, and for I think this is something parents who have lost a child or a couple of children or a number of children will definitely relate to. You talk about that moment when someone approaches you and asks you, how many children do you have? Can you talk to us about that? I think it'll be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a difficult situation to navigate every time. If somebody doesn't know you and doesn't know your story and what you've been through, and they're just making conversation and they say something like that, how many kids do you have? This is a normal thing for someone to ask. And you always have to, as a bereaved parent, you always have to sort of go through this calculation in your mind of, okay, do I want to say I have 5 children or however many it is for you? And if I do, then the next question is going to be, well, tell me about them. And inevitably, you're going to get to that place in the conversation where you have to say, well, one of them's passed away. And that's going to take this other person, this poor, unsuspecting stranger, into this whole conversation that they weren't trying to have when they were just trying to be nice and make small talk with you. And so you have this sort of calculation that you run. Do I do that? Do I say the truth and hope it doesn't go all the way down to the let's talk about my child who died? Or do I say a number that's one less than that and refer to my living children? And when you do that, then you have a whole different set of problems that you run through in your mind of I'm pretending like one of my children didn't exist, and I'm denying the existence of this person who died that meant so much to me. And so it creates this conundrum for bereaved parents of what do you say? And so for us, we've just come to this place where we say we have five, one passed away and the other four are living, and we have a great family. And then sometimes that leads into a whole different conversation. And often it turns out to be that the other person has had something that's hurtful to them in the past, and that turns out to be a healing conversation. So it doesn't always end poorly, but it is always it's always a construct in your mind when someone asks that question.
I find that so a lot of us don't know what to say to somebody when they reveal something like that. Um, what would you say is something we should all kind of have in the back of our minds to comfort?
I think the best thing that's turned out for us after 10 years is just when somebody says, "I'm so sorry. That's really hard. I'm really sorry." That's enough. I mean, people don't need you to um they don't need you to make it better for them. They're already processing it on their own. But that human connection of someone saying, "Gosh, that's hard. I'm so sorry." That is an honest and always helpful assessment of the situation. What's not helpful is people who, when we're uncomfortable, we think we have to say a lot, and we start sort of saying, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel." Well, no, you don't know how I feel. Even if you've lost a child, we don't really know how each other feels because we had a whole different relationship with that person. So I
Yeah.
know how you feel isn't the best thing to say. And for Christians, especially, we start to espouse scripture sometimes, and some of the scriptures that we say don't make people feel better. There's this verse in Romans that says all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, and that's for some reason something people say after you lose a child, and it just hits really harmfully because it's not good to lose a child, and you can't even imagine early on, especially, how anything good could ever come out of losing a child. But that scripture is out there, and people use it, and so it's harmful almost. So there's something that can be said for something that's true but not appropriate for the moment that you're in. And so I think we need to use less words, and words that are universal, like "I'm so sorry, this is hard." Those are better than trying to either overtalk or to say things that might feel spiritual but really don't work in the moment. And I guess the last thing is I'm careful now about ascribing things to God that are not in God's character. And again, an example of that is people say things like, "Well, I guess God needed your son more than you did."
Oof,
That's
yeah.
a terrible thing to say,
Mhm.
because God, if you believe in a God who can speak and create a universe, then he could surely create another child if he needed one. He didn't have to take mine, right? Like, so that's just a harmful, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We can sometimes say things that turn out to be hurtful, even though we're trying to be helpful. So I think, "I'm sorry, this is really hard. I'll be praying for you. I'm really sorry that happened." Those are always helpful things.
Right. And what you just touched upon, that, sometimes we all, maybe also all, I think we're all guilty of it. We use scripture, but it's lacking the spirit, and we are not discerning to use it in the right moment.
Yeah.
How can we get better at that? Because I think that's not just with scripture, but just generally in conversation. A lot of times how can we know the right things to communicate to the other person?
I think thinking ahead in your life, just conversations like the one we're just having a plan for how we're going to handle these hard things when they come about is a wise move. So as an adult, you're aware that people have hard things happen in their lives, and it's wise to spend a little bit of time thinking ahead of time. What would I say if somebody told me that this happened or that happened? How would I be helpful to them in that moment? And even in your prayer life, that prayer of the Psalms, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, God." Like that idea ahead of time. I want the things that come out of my mouth to always be helpful to other people. So maybe I'll spend a little bit of time thinking and researching and reading what are helpful things to say when somebody loses a child or when somebody goes through a really massive thing. How can I come alongside them as a caregiver? And so I think that's wise. So first of all, just spend some time thinking about it. Listening to your podcast is going to be helpful to somebody in that regard. But also think of times when you've been hurting and something bad's happened in your life, and what were things that people said to you that made it worse or made it better, and
Mhm.
maybe just think through those things. Like, gosh, when somebody says those things, it really hurts more than it helps, and so I don't want to commit that same error. And so I'd like to be. I had a friend. He's a hospital chaplain, John Swanson. He's a
Mhm.
really good writer, and he says his 20 years of experience as a hospital chaplain, the thing he's learned that's the most helpful is when he shows up and shuts up. Like he says, I show up and I just tell people I love them and I don't talk. And how can I help you? What can I do for you? I'm so sorry. And he just says less and shows up more. So I think presence, genuine compassion, and maybe less words and more care is probably the big picture.
Well, that's beautiful. I think we do take for granted that actually just showing up for someone and being in a calm state offers them something, offers
Yeah.
them that deep empathy, right?
Yep, exactly. And there's a whole science emerging of the electromagnetic field that humans put off, and we know now that your electromagnetic field extends about 5 yards around your body all the time, and this explains that phenomenon that all of us have faced when somebody who's in a really good mood can come into a room and all of a sudden you just feel a little bit better. And it's because their heart rate is calm and their neurotransmitters are all lined up with good things, and they influence your electromagnetic field. And it's physics that influences you positively. But that's the same problem when somebody's that's really mad or angry or in an obviously bad attitude walks into a room, and they call them Debbie Downers in the United States, that somebody walks in and just has a really bad attitude and everybody feels worse and no words have been exchanged yet, right? And it's because if that person's field is way off, then it affects your heart rate, it affects your brain chemistry, it affects your whole spirit. And so I think being aware that our presence has an impact on other people's physiology and their neurochemistry is important. And it's really true. It's been well studied now. They've even done some studies where they have people in different rooms that don't know about each other's presence, and they're measuring heart rate and all of these things, physiological parameters, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate. And they ask one person to be in a really bad mood and be grumpy, and it'll affect the heart rate of a person in another room that doesn't know that person's there. And so we definitely have an impact on the people around us, and that puts a responsibility on us, really. Like if you're going to interact with somebody who's hurting, you can make it worse by just not being in a pleasant space and you're in your own mind with them. So get your emotional state in check and try to minister to people even if no words are spoken.
Oh my goodness. You see, I think I've always assumed that because in my native language, I'm Somali, we say that when you meet someone, within 2 minutes of meeting them, you get a sense that stays with you for your whole life about them. But
Yeah.
so I sort of knowing that because it's something that I was taught from a young age, I take it for granted. But what you're saying is there's actually now scientific proof to show that what the state of someone is something that we can feel.
Yep, absolutely.
That's that's so powerful. But okay, so what do we do about that? Because especially as doctors, you know, you're healing someone. So are you saying that actually it's really important that doctors and nurses and people who are caretakers also practice self-care and have that type of awareness?
Absolutely. I just read a study. I can't quote where it came from. I'll try to find it for you. Where they took married couples and they put them in a room together, and they used a little suction cup to create a little blister on their arms. They created a wound basically on each of the married couple's arms. And they said, now have a 30-minute conversation in which you don't get distressed at all. Just have a talk with each other. And then they just had a pleasant conversation. And then they measured in their blood for the next 3 weeks the proteins associated with wound healing and how fast it took those wounds to heal. And then after those wounds healed, they brought the same married couples back and generated the wounds again and said, now we want you to fight about something that you argue about at home. And some of the fights got pretty nasty. You know, they're calling each other names and the kinds of ways that married people interact sometimes. And they measured those same proteins in wound healing, and they found it took 40% longer for those wounds to heal when there had been high stress at the time that the wounds were incited, and that 3 or 4 of the measurable proteins that we know to be involved in wound healing were significantly diminished in those groups that had the fight when the wounds were occurring. So what that tells us is the state of your emotions at the time that you're injured affects how your body physically heals for up to 3 weeks afterwards. So that's tremendously important as a caregiver, as me as a surgeon and a physician. Like, I'm about to operate on someone, I need to make sure not only that their body is ready to go, that they don't have an infection or a fever or any of those things, but also that their mind is in a good space. If I know that patient is in some kind of serious distress or, you know, having a problem at home or something like that, maybe that's not the best time to perform major surgery on them, because it's going to affect how they heal.
Wow. Why is it, do you think, this aspect? I mean, we hear all the time, almost every disease comes from stress. We
Yeah.
know that, yet we create so much stress. I mean, I look at the way we communicate now, and I can see such a rapid deterioration. Like when I was growing up, journalists, people in media had to be professional. They had to be objective. And now our mass media itself is hysterical and causes
Yeah.
you to be stressed. Everyone is opinionated, rude, belligerent. And it's hard to believe that we know what we know, and yet we take the actions that we take to disseminate stress in every way.
That's right. It's fascinating to me, especially like you look at what we know about. There was a huge study of 17,000 adults that Kaiser Permanente organization ran a few years ago that looked at what they call adverse childhood experiences, right? So these kids that are raised in homes where they have physical or verbal abuse or significant marital stress or sexual abuse and all kinds of things like that, alcoholism in the home. And they followed these kids, or they looked at these people as adults and then did research about what happened to them as children. And they found that people that had significant adverse childhood events or a stressful home were something like 5 times more likely to smoke. They were something like 3 times more likely to suffer major depression. They were 30% more likely to have a suicide attempt in their life. And that men who were raised in homes like that had a 4,000% increase in using illegal drugs in their life, all from the stress associated growing up in a home where there was a lot of environmental distress. So what does that tell us? It tells us that our brains are significantly altered and shaped, and our future lives are affected by things that have happened to us in the past, right? So what does that do for us going forward? It says I need to be very careful how I influence the people around me and the things I allow into my own mind, because I'm teaching my brain I'm teaching my DNA how to turn proteins and gene expressions on and off to make heart disease happen and make diabetes happen and all these things that happen in response to stress. So we need to learn. You're right. Everybody knows the things that we ought to be doing in our lives. We ought to be seeking a more healthy lifestyle. We ought to be seeking a lower stress environment and all of that. We all know it. But at the same time, we're drinking more than ever and we're sleeping less than ever and we're spending more time on social media that we know is bad for our brain. So why the disconnect? And I think it's really hard to understand that, but I think it kind of goes back to what we said earlier about people. We look at people who have a system and a doctrine and a set of knowledge, but we're not all very good at keeping it. So
Mm.
right. So I
Yeah.
think for us, it comes down to individual choices of saying, hey, what kind of life do I want to create for myself? And I know that I can change my life by changing my mind. My brain changes how my neurotransmitters work. That affects my hormonal status. That affects the gene expression at the DNA level. And it even affects how my offspring are born, what sets of things they're afraid of or happy with when they're born. So knowing all of that, we have then a great responsibility and a great opportunity to have better lives.
And I think you're someone who can actually, you're a testament to that, because you are a physician, a neurosurgeon in Iraq, right? Right
Yeah.
at the heart of when the war started.
Yeah.
And so, what can you talk to us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So I was really blessed to receive a scholarship to attend medical school from the United States Air Force. And so they paid for my school. And in exchange for that, I spent 4 years in the Air Force, United States Air Force, when I got out of my training. And right at the tail end of my time of paying back that scholarship, I got sent to the Iraq War in 2005 and spent half of 2005 in a tent hospital right in the middle of the Sunni Triangle at a time when we were still getting mortared every day. And there was a lot of car bombs and all that really significant trauma happening every day. And so I had the experience as a surgeon of having to do a lot of things that we're not trained for in civilian hospitals, right? We don't see car bombs go off and we don't see 30 people get injured at the same time 3 times a day. We just don't see that. And the other thing we didn't see was the resource management side of everything because we're there in a tent hospital with limited resources and almost unlimited stream of patients. So we had things happen like a hospital would run out of blood and you would hear somebody would announce overhead, hey, we need B positive blood. And people would literally, American medics would go down the hall and roll up their sleeve and donate their own blood to the terrorist who just set this bomb off so that we could try to save them. It's just things like that that you don't see in a normal environment. And so I saw a lot of the worst things that people can do to one another, Sophia, and came home really with a lot of that stuff kind of jammed down inside of me. And it took years for it to sort of bubble back up to the surface. And I encountered in 2010 a real serious sort of blow up of what we now would call post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome. And took a couple of years to work through all that. That's really when I started writing. Was my wife made the kind suggestion that I needed to unpack some of those things and started sort of journaling and writing about them. That turned into my first book, Hope is the No Place to Hide, which is really a memoir about all of that stuff. But I think what it did for me, in retrospect, looking at it now, 15 years later, almost 20 years later, is it taught me that I could be resilient in really difficult situations. It taught me to be prepared for something really hard, literally the bomb going off. And what it did then is later in my life, when other massive things happened, like losing our son, I think it helped me have a little bit of an ability to say, wait a minute, this doesn't have to be the end of me. Like I know that I've been through really hard things before. I know that my faith held up. I know that my family held up. And so therefore we're going to find a way to get through this event too. So I think that became the beginning of this idea that I had, that hope really relies on memory of the past and movement towards the future, that you've shown yourself that you've made it through something hard and walked through it before, and you can do it again.
That's really beautiful that you say that. In I've seen the end of you. You say that in the moment of meeting a patient, that you have to decide: are you going to be a detached surgeon, or are you going to be personable and have a personal relationship? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I think it's people, as you said earlier, you make your first impression of someone really quickly when you meet them. And so as a physician, like if I come in really cold and clinical and here's the facts and I'm going to do this operation but I'm not going to be involved in your life, it's hard then to develop empathy or a really good relationship with the family and the patient later. And if I come in overly human and too connected to them, then it's really hard sometimes to make the really difficult treatment decisions and deliver really hard news to people sometimes if you're too connected to them. So there's this balance that I have to face of being a real human person and also being really honest and calculated and clinical when I need to be. And to tell you the truth, I think I got a lot better as a physician after my son died, because I had never been in that position of sort of being the sufferer before. I had dealt with lots of people hurting and dying and had delivered bad news a lot, but I hadn't been on that receiving end of it before. And now I was with those folks down in that, I call it the pit of despair. That's a reference from the Bible. But this idea that you're in this dark hole and everything hurts and you feel like you're on fire and all those things that your body does when you're really suffering, that I hadn't been there before. And so now that I have, when I encounter a patient, fortunate now. I feel a lot more human with them than I did before. It's not such a calculation of how am I going to handle this interaction. It's more of a I'm going to help this person get through this problem.
Right. Because I would have thought that if you decide you're going to make an instant connection and you haven't trained yourself, like you say, like life hasn't trained you to deal with the kind of suffering, so that you're actually very present through it all. I would imagine then that your actually ability to be a surgeon and remove the tumor and do the things that you actually have to do are impaired, or if you're too emotional and
It
attached.
can be. I mean, if you become there is sort of a line that you can cross where it's hard to do the things you have to do because you're too close to the person. So that's a constant sort of concern as well. But I think the experience of taking care of lots and lots of these people though hones that skill like anything else. You learn how to do the things that you're called to do well by repetition and experience, right? And then also sort of introspection of looking back at how did that go and what could I have done differently and how could I have done that better. And I think that's something we all need to do in our lives, right? Look back. That's why they call it practicing in medicine, by the way. I think you never really have it down. You're constantly honing it as you go through your career. But that willingness to look back at a situation and say, gosh, maybe I could have handled that differently, or I think I did that well. That's a really valuable tool to use, that retrospection.
Hmm. And so, because you dealt with so many people, I think there's thousands of people that you had to look after when you were in Iraq, right?
Yeah.
And so, having that, witnessing that much loss, were you able to reference that in cases later on?
Yeah. I think the one of the bonuses or benefits, if you can call it that, that I got from being in the Iraq War was this idea that there's never really a situation where you're completely out of control in the operating room. Like, oh, I'll see something in the United States that's a real problem clinically, and I'll say, "Gosh, this is nothing like that guy that had the car bomb go off next to him," and I'll remember what we did and how we managed it, and I'll take a breath and calm down and never really get too stressed out in the operating room anymore. And I've joked with my team a million times, like, "Hey, if nobody's shooting at us, we're in pretty good shape. We we can get through this operation." And so I think I did take that home with me, that sort of ability to call on really difficult situations, call on times before when I was really stressed out, and recall that I'm not in that situation now. And by the way, that you didn't ask the question, but that's one of the keys to dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder is to reorient yourself into the now when you're feeling these things, because what happens is your brain, some sound will occur or something inciting event will occur, and it'll put you back in this position where you feel like you're in that place and in that danger again. And the secret to getting through those moments is to say, wait, time out. I am not in Iraq right now. I am in Nebraska. I'm in London, and I'm not there. And this sound that I heard is not that rocket that's coming to kill me. It's not. It was a taxi that backfired. Right. You reorient yourself with fact, and that'll begin to pull your emotional state back towards the present and what's really happening now. And you can generally, or frequently anyway, talk yourself out of those panic attacks and out of those moments. Now, sometimes you need therapy, sometimes you need medication, sometimes you need a professional, but that's a good tool, is to say, wait a minute, am I really experiencing that? I feel like I'm experiencing this, but am I really? And that reminding yourself that feelings aren't facts, feelings are chemical events that are happening in your brain that are pointing you towards an emotional response that you get to decide, you get to add the meaning to that feeling. And you need to attach proper meanings to the feelings. And that's how you can start to decode those flashbacks.
Is that sort of cognitive therapy that, people have to actually have some cognitive?
Yep.
Yeah, because I have a neighbor who actually she just turned 105 the past weekend.
Wow.
Yeah. And so she was telling me, she survived World War II, and she was, I think, just a few years back, she was invited to this airfield to watch a beautiful, spectacular air show. She loves air shows, but she said she didn't think that it would trigger her being a child and the bombardment all
Wow.
this time later. And I don't think she's ever had therapy, but do you think that would explain why? Is she hasn't had enough air shows to sort of rewire how she sees that?
Exactly. I think so because you have to have something triggering that old memory to recognize that you have that propensity to be triggered in such a way, right? So if you haven't if you've been isolated from it for so many years, and I think that's one of the reasons why drinking and numbing yourself to these things is so dangerous because you insulate yourself from working through the thing that's actually hurting you, and then when it does happen or something similar happens, you haven't built yourself any resilience around how to manage it, and then it's just devastating, right? So I think that your neighbor, that's a great story. Yeah, if she had seen some of those things over the years, she would have recognized that they're triggering to her. She would have found a way to get some help to work through them, and then they wouldn't bother her so much. But 60, 70 years later, it's the first time she's encountered that stimulus again. It's natural for it to come back.
Yeah. I think we do think that sometimes we think that, let's say, I mean, not even in those kinds of extreme circumstances, but if you're just even going through a breakup or a divorce or something like that, you
Yeah,
think, okay, I'm just going to let time pass and I'm going to fill up my day with this and that. And you won't know when it catches you out, right? When the emotions
that's
that
right.
you've been pushing down actually
That's right.
re-
Time does not heal all wounds. I mean, a common cliche, but it doesn't. Time doesn't heal all wounds. What heals wounds is recognizing them and applying appropriate treatment to them. And that's why I use all this medical metaphor terminology in my books. Is like, let's have a plan. Let's have a treatment plan. Let's have a self brain surgery. Let's have something that's going to help you process that and deal with it in an appropriate way, perform the right operation, if you will. Time doesn't heal it. You've got to deal with it.
Oh, see, I had sort of rewritten that rule. I always thought it's important, whatever you're going through, to face it in the moment. But in the last few years, I kind of got into all this new self-help where it's, or if you don't talk about it, then it becomes an unconscious, it fades into the background, and then I don't know, your brain disconnects from that and it's gone forever. Is that not true then?
I don't think so. I think you have subconscious traces of everything that's ever happened to you, right? And some things don't need to be dealt with. There's some small offense or slight that happens in your life, or some thing happened that wasn't particularly traumatic to you. You don't necessarily have to go and talk to your therapist about every moment of your entire life. I think that's not always helpful. But when you've got something that's a real significant traumatic event or some major thing that you've been through or major loss that you've suffered, I think it is wise to deal with it. I think it's wise to unpack it. And in my own case, it was 5 years later before that came roaring out of me. You know, that whole PTSD thing in my life happened. One day we were sitting at a stoplight and a helicopter went by, and I just checked out. My wife said sat through 2 cycles of the red light, and she had to shake me to say, "Hey, what's going on with you?" Like, I just boom, I was back in Iraq. And so I had never dealt with all the things that I saw and felt over there. And I think that kind of thing happens when we don't properly process our traumas.
Yeah. So when you came back, you just sort of just threw yourself into work and life and all of that.
Yeah, I was unfortunately I was going through a divorce at the time, and I moved from one state to another where my children were, and literally just came home and took all my military stuff and put it in the garage, and went to work, and was out of the Air Force a few weeks later, and it was in a civilian environment where nobody had known me before and nobody had been in the war with me. I didn't have any colleagues who had said, "Hey, remember when this thing happened?" So there was literally, it was like I took this experience of my life and just put it in the garage and went to a new life with new people, and never dealt with it, which is a horrible. Don't do that. It's not a good way to
Really?
do it. But then it
I
just,
would think it's the perfect thing to do. Start over.
well, it might be in a sense of moving on in your life, but if you don't deal with the trauma, it's going to deal with you at some point. Like, it's going to come back at some point, and it never comes back at a convenient time. So I think you do need to deal with those things in a healthy way at the appropriate time.
Okay. That's actually really powerful to know. And you think that prevents you from having the type of complete breakdown later on?
I think it can be certainly helpful.
Okay. Do you think hope can be learned by everyone.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the major misconceptions that people have about hope. I think people think you're either an optimistic person, a hopeful person, or you're not. You have to have some sort of set of genetic predispositions to be, optimistic. Um, but that's not true. It turns out that hope can be generated by a willful decision to look at the situation that you're in. And I call it memory and movement. The hope researchers talk about two things they call agency and pathways. And agency means that you have some ability to do something about the thing that you're hoping for. So if you, hope to be if you, let's say you're imprisoned, right? You committed some crime and you're in jail and you're literally physically locked in a jail cell and you hope that you can go to another country and travel. That's not reasonable. You don't have agency to do that thing right then. So you can't really be hopeful for it. You can wish for it, but you can't really be hopeful for it because you don't have agency. You're locked in a situation. So you need to have some ability to do something about agency. And then you need to have what they call pathways, which means there's some way that you can build a mental construct of steps that you could take to make this thing happen. So not only it's possible, but there's also a reasonable path to make it happen. So agency and pathways are the two components that the hope researchers have elucidated for you to be able to say reasonably, I could get there from here. And that's what begins to generate hope. In the faith element, I like to add these two components of memory and movement and understanding that hope is an action word, it's a verb. And memory means, like we talked about before, I'm not alone in this. Other people have encountered a situation like this and made it through. Therefore, it is possible for humans to do this. And I've been through this hard thing and that hard thing before, and somehow I made it through. So I remember that it's possible. And then I find some steps to take to move towards the goal that I want to accomplish. So in the Christian realm, that would be, God's made all these promises to me, and I'm going to just take steps as if they are already true, and then they're going to start coming true. So I've got hope by flexing those muscles of memory and movement. I have agency, I have pathway, I can get there from here. Anybody can generate that type of hope. So if you're not stuck with being pessimistic or negative, if you decide that your situation that you're in is unacceptable to you and you want to find a path forward, the first dose of it is hope.
Hmm. So there are people who lose everything they have and everyone they have. So even for someone like that, they can start to take some steps. It's hard to imagine, right? Like I think I was watching this in the Moroccan earthquake. There are people who literally lost everything, an
Yeah.
entire family gone, and there's just one person left. So someone like that, let's take that extreme example. Even someone like that could
Yeah,
find.
I mean, the bottom line is that there's always a way to reframe the experience that you're in, right? So you've gone through this devastating event, and certainly devastating if your entire family's lost and your house is gone and all those things, but you're alive.
Yes, okay.
So your heart is beating, your body is alive, the sun is coming up again that day, and you can say to yourself, "I didn't die." So I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to say, yes, I'm devastated. Yes, I've lost everything, but I'm still here. And if you believe in God, then you'll say, there's a reason why I'm still here. There's some purpose and meaning in my life. Viktor Frankl talked about how when you give suffering purpose, it stops feeling like suffering because now you've got purpose. Now you've got a reason to still be drawing a breath. And so it's not something that you can think about in the moment that event occurs. It's like an acute injury and you got to stop the bleeding before you can really start moving toward what am I going to do with my life now? But I think the first step is to say, wait, I'm alive. So
Mhm.
therefore, this isn't the end of my story. So what does the rest of my story look like? And that's what I can begin to build on from the next breath forward.
I really love that. For you as a surgeon, what have you observed with people who, let's say, you're giving them the worst diagnosis? Have you found there's a difference between people who cultivate hope versus those who just feel resigned?
Yeah, this has actually also been well studied. So people that lose hope, I say hopelessness is the deadliest disease known to mankind because if you lose hope, it's been well studied. Even if you survive the illness that you have, you never recover your quality of life, your peace of mind, your happiness, whatever you want to call it. that people who lose hope, they have worse outcomes. They stay in the hospital longer. They take more medicine. They have more postoperative complications. They have more trouble with their marriages. They have more trouble with their families. They drink more alcohol, take more pain medication. People who lose hope, even if they survive, their life isn't as good as those who have high hope and still may die or succumb to their illness. So it's just, this person too. Somebody who something bad happened to them 10 or 15 years ago and they didn't die, but something bad happened to them. And you bump into them on the street today and you say, "Hey, how's it going?" And they say, "Oh, I'm just still thinking about that thing that happened. I'm still, mourning my person that died 10 years ago. I'm on my way to a support group from my kid that died 30 years ago." You see people who have never been able to move past that defining event that has become the only thing that they think about in their whole life, right? It
Yeah.
becomes the thing, that massive thing. It's all they can think about and feel. And I would just submit that that's not a very high quality of life, right? If you've suffered this thing and that then becomes your entire defining, orbiting, gravitational system for the rest of your life, as opposed to somebody else that who's going through something. They might be dying of cancer, but somehow they manage to make you feel better every time you see them. Like you talk to that person and they're like, "Yeah, I've had a really good life and I'm just trying to make sure my kids know how much I love them, and I'm struggling with this illness, but boy, I'm so grateful for all the things that I've been through." You've seen those two extremes. Like this one person is dying, but they're coming alive and they're telling a beautiful story with their life because they have hope, and
Yeah.
another person who's living but their life is over because they've lost hope as they've gone through these hard things. That the contrast between those two people is stunning, but we all know them. And so I've seen just numerous examples of people who have gone through just unacceptably difficult and horrible situations, but they tell these beautiful stories with their lives and they become the kinds of people that you want to write movies about and watch on the screen because they're just heroes, right? And the
Mhm.
reason is because they held on to hope.
Yeah. I think you perfectly described my neighbor actually, because I had a fall last week and I hurt my knee. And, I like to think, okay, I've had a setback. I'm going to make sure that this time I fortify myself and come out even stronger. So I
Yeah.
tried to immediately have that kind of attitude. But she's 105 on a walker and she sees me limping and she's completely just concerned for me. What happened to your knee? Well, I make sure you watch yourself. Oh, were you drinking? How did you fall down the stairs? She always finds a way to make everyone feel better and
Yeah.
would never. You talk actually about build a life that can't be taken from us. And you
Yeah.
say, for example, that when people are getting married, they think we build the life of our dreams in our head. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah. It is a good thing. But my point about that is if you define your ability to be happy and to be at peace with your own life, if you define that based on the presence of people or circumstances that you could lose, and we do it all the time. When I make this amount of money, then I'll be happy. When I win this award, then I'll be happy. When my book becomes a bestseller, then I'll be happy. When the girl of my dreams says yes, she'll marry me, then I'll be happy. But what happens then? That person gets a brain tumor and dies, or you have a best-selling book and then your next book is terrible and nobody reads it, right? You've defined your happiness based on that thing, and now you've lost that thing. And we see it all the time. Look at celebrities and former politicians and movie stars and athletes. After their prime is over, they become alcoholics, they become penniless, they spend all their money, that they don't have anything that defines them because they shot at the thing and they hit it, and then after it happened and they lost it, they didn't have a real life underneath it. And so my point about all that is you need to build your life on some things that cannot be taken from you and can't crumble over time, like hopefulness, like faith for me, like this belief that I get to see my son again someday, like those kinds of things. You can't take that away from someone. That's why, again, to quote Viktor Frankl, the end of his book, Man's Search for Meaning, has this beautiful line about how mankind, people can come up with this horrible invention of the gas chamber but at the same time, another person can walk into that gas chamber with the Shema Yisrael or the Lord's Prayer on their lips. Like human spirit can be so indomitable that it can face the greatest challenges and still have a prayer on its tongue. That's hope. That's hope in action. And I think if you can have that kind of spirit about you, then you become sort of bulletproof about whatever can happen in your life. Nobody can take that away from you, no matter what happens. And I think that's really a life worth living.
I think we all get this stages of grief kind of thing in our head, right?
Yep.
And when you talk about dogma, I think this is probably what happens is something will go viral and we will sort of misappropriate it and we'll think, and it just becomes words in our mind. So for
Yep.
example, something terrible happened and you're thinking, okay, I have to go through this type of stage. At first I'll probably go through anger, then I have to do this, and for some people maybe that's what keeps them 15 years stuck. How can we
Yeah.
think that so that we don't have to waste so much of our lives not accepting?
I think that's an important point you make. Whoever's listening to this needs to understand that we have co-opted Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model, and we've turned it into a prescription that we write for everybody who's grieving or hurting over something hard. And the problem with that is her research, Dr. Kubler-Ross's research, was not based on what happens when you lose a child or what happens when your spouse dies or what happens when you lose your job. It wasn't that. Her research specifically looked at how do people respond when they find out they are dying of some type of terminal illness. So
Mhm.
she was researching cancer patients and the things that they do, psychology and biology of them, what happens after they get the news that they're dying. And she found that they generally follow sort of a reproducible process of, denying it and becoming angry about it and bargaining or actually asking God to intervene and then getting depressed and finally coming to accept it. And that model somehow got into our psychology courses in high school and college and got into the internet. And now everybody thinks that's how humans grieve over everything. And it just isn't. So what I've learned as a bereaved parent and what I've learned at taking care of patients with cancer and head injuries for 25 years, people don't grieve in the same way. And that's why I wrote in the book, in the new book, we may suffer together, but we grieve alone. Like everybody has a different process, and those processes take a different amount of time. And you do people real harm. We do people real harm when we put a clock in our minds on how long it should take them to grieve over something or where they should be in that process. And we do it to ourselves too. Like, don't think that there's a rational basis for you predicting how long it should take you to process this thing that you're going through. Now, obviously, if it's 20 years and you're still in your basement drinking Jack Daniels every day, that's probably not very healthy, right? So there may come some time when people who love you are saying, "Hey, let's get you some help. It's time to kind of move forward a little bit." But don't put that undue pressure on yourself to say, "Well, gosh, I should be at acceptance by now. It's been 2 years since my spouse died." You may not. You may take longer than that. So just understand that model was applied to society in general, but it was never intended to be used as an orderly process of how humans grieve. It just wasn't. That's not what her research was about.
That's really helpful to know because I know people who recently lost their mother and they say that they are not finding that they're going through that. It's
Right.
completely different. There are days when they feel they've forgotten and then they feel guilty for forgetting.
Yeah.
And they feel like, oh, I should be feeling like this. It's only been a month. But you're saying people shouldn't feel held hostage to that kind of idea. So tell
That's right.
me what's helpful then? Is it to just be present with your grief?
I think so. And to say, I do know that there will come a time when I need to move through this. It's not today. And people were really helpful to us. They understood like that you're making progress if the first week you didn't get out of your house, and the second week you checked the mail, and the third week you went to the store and bought some milk, and the fourth week you went back to work, or fifth week or eighth week or whatever. If you're making some progress in your life, I think that's reasonable. If you're stuck, if you find that it's been 2 years and you can't get out of bed in the morning, that's probably morphed into depression, and you probably need some help with that, right? So just maybe give yourself lots of grace and lots of time, but also recognize that there should be a healing process over time. And if you feel like you're not making progress, then instead of beating yourself up about it, get some help. Reach out to a friend or a loved one or a therapist or a doctor or a pastor, somebody to say, hey, can you help me walk through this difficult season I'm having in my life, and help me understand it, help me make progress so that I don't get stuck here.
You say don't treat a bad feeling with a bad operation. And
Yeah,
treating a bad feeling with a bad operation is kind of taking on these bad habits, right? A poor
that's right.
diet, alcohol, over smoking, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Don't take something that's making you feel bad. This thing happened and I'm feeling bad, and treat it with something that's going to not fix that thing and also create other problems in your life. Alcohol is the best example. We have something that hurts. We don't want to feel it. We numb ourselves. We use alcohol or drugs or shopping or sex or something else to numb ourselves so we don't feel that thing. And then the next day, we feel the consequences of that decision that we made, and we still have the original problem to deal with because we used a bad operation. We used a bad treatment for the thing that was making us feel bad, and that never works out.
Mm. So when you say biopsy your thinking, you're saying try and stay present, or is there something else you can add to that?
Yeah, I just use the thought biopsy technique as a way to say, because we know that most of the thoughts that pop into our head aren't true. It turns out to be about 5 to 1. You have negative thinking that's not generally true. And because we know that the feelings that we feel aren't necessarily facts, they're often lies, or often just pointing us towards something that's not really true. Because we know that, then it's unwise to react to every thought that we have as if it were true. And it's much more wise and helpful to say, to build a little pause into your brain to say, let me take this thought and look at it for a second and think about it before I decide what meaning to attach to it and how to respond to it. And if you can learn how to do that, which is what my whole podcast is about, if you can learn how to do that, then you can begin to take control of your thinking and direct it in a way that's helpful to you instead of continuing to harm yourself with negative thinking.
You talk about how you were doing that, right? When after your son passed, you found yourself constantly going back to, I should have done this, I could have done this. I imagine that's something that most parents will feel. Not even if your child passes, but like anything that happens to them, you constantly blame yourself. Let's say if they become addicted to drugs or anything, how do we stop ourselves from that? How did you biopsy your own thoughts?
Well, I think that it becomes this process of understanding that your thinking is constantly either helping you move forward in your life or it's taking you backwards in your life. And if you can admit that to yourself, that overly negative thinking is harmful to me, then you start to say, I'm going to become more aggressive at examining my thinking and deciding to take action only when it's helpful. You will have all this survivor's guilt. You'll have all these negative thoughts that tell you that it was your fault or you could have done something different. And sometimes those thoughts are true. Like, especially as a bereaved parent, you'll have a thought like, I'm never going to stop hurting over this. That's true. But what often happens is the next thought is untrue. Like, I'll never stop hurting over this, so my life no longer has meaning. So I might as well just drink, and I'm going to end up divorced, and I'm going to end up homeless. Then you start having all these secondary thoughts that are not true, but they're progressively more harmful if you take action as if they are true. Right. So what you have to do then is say, okay, I had this thought, this feeling that's based in something that happened to me. It turns out to be a true thought. I'll always be sad over losing my son. But what happens next is I have to challenge the fact that that is going to produce this set of consequences, because I can direct my own steps to make those consequences progressively better for me instead of progressively worse by taking control of my thinking.
Well, that's beautiful to hear, but also I would like for you to expand a little bit on what you say about that pain never going away, that you'll never stop hurting. Does that mean that it's ever present?
Well, it is true that if you suffer a great loss, when you think of it, it will always be a painful thought. It will always be a painful feeling. You'll never stop hurting if you lose a child. It'll never stop hurting. What happens over time, though, is it becomes a part of your lifetime emotional experience and not the defining
Mm.
determinant of your current emotional state. And so
Hmm.
what you do is you become able to separate it from the present. Yes, it's a painful, hurtful thing that's part of my story, but it's not the thing that defines how I have to live my life now. That really turns out to be the most important thing, I think, in recovering from any sort of major trauma, which is kind of what I wrote the book about.
Yeah. What are other traumas that you find are very hard for us to get over?
Well, I think any sort of physical injury, major physical trauma, the loss of another person, the loss of a spouse, especially, or a child, a parent, and then also these less obvious ones are things like losing a dream that you've been pursuing for a long time. Is you've been working your whole life to become the first clarinetist in the Philharmonic, and you're not going to make it. Like you're just not going to get there, and you have to admit that to yourself. Like, I've spent 20 years of my life pursuing this thing, and it is not going to happen. Or you finally made it to, you know, the field for the World Cup and you tear your ACL during warmups and you're not going to get to play in the World Cup. That's a major trauma that
Mhm.
you're going to have to face, that you're not a football player anymore, right? So, see, I'm an American, but I use football properly there, right? So you're not going to make it, that the dream died and you now have to refocus and reorient your life. That's a major thing. That's a massive trauma. And so that's sort of what I mean. The other massive things, they're not all medical, they're not all relational. Sometimes it's something else.
That's wonderful. I think we should wrap up with, can you share some of your favorite verses, scripture that can leave people feeling hopeful?
Yeah, I think there's two. One is 2 Corinthians 10:5, which is self brain surgery in the Bible. It would take captive every thought and put it into submission to God. So every thought that you have can either help you or harm you. And if you don't learn how to take command of them, then you're going to have a hard time in your life. You're reacting to your thinking instead of directing it. And so that's one, 2 Corinthians 10:5. The second one from the Old Testament is Psalm 71:14, which it's what I sign when I sign copies of Hope is the First Dose. As for me, I will always have hope. You can always choose hope. You can always create hope. You can always fight for hope. You don't ever have to be hopeless because it's action word. It's active. It's not passive. You're not a victim of hopelessness because you can create hope and it's always there. That's why I say hope is the first dose. I can give you the best treatment plan for your problem. I can give you the best operation, the best prescription. But if you don't think it's going to help you, you won't bother to go to the hospital to have the surgery that you need. You've got to have hope. You have to have hope. It's the first dose of anything that can help you.
That makes so much sense. So, what are examples that you can give us of some of your patients who, through hope overcame a lot of, either healed themselves or overcame suffering?
I think the best one is a story I told in my second book. I've seen the interviews. A young man named Joey. I'll leave you with this. He developed brain cancer, and he was a guy who had never had anything good happen to him in his whole life. His mother had died when he was born. His father was an alcoholic, drug addict, and Joey ended up in jail and ended up in a fight with a police officer and got clocked in the head and had a head injury. That's when I met him. And I was fixing a skull fracture when I discovered that he had a brain tumor that he didn't know about. And it turned out to be brain cancer. And he received that news like basically, of course I have cancer. Why wouldn't I? My whole life's been terrible. Why wouldn't I also have brain cancer? He had nothing to help him feel good about his life. But somehow, over the last 12 months of his life, he was befriended by a hospital chaplain, and he reconnected with his grandmother, and he found somebody who loved him from his school, and he came alive in his spirit and became a whole different person during the year in which his body was dying of cancer. And he told me shortly before he died, he said, "This has been the best year of my life because I found something to have purpose. I have found hope in my life, and I'm dying, but I'm alive for the first time in my entire existence." And that's a good example of what hope can do for somebody.
Oh wow, that's so beautiful. It was so amazing talking to you. I could talk to you forever, and I really do hope that you will come back.
Love to. It was a great privilege to be with you on the show today, Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Speak again.
That was
Bye.
really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Hi. I believe sharing is caring. I recently took a tumble down the stairs and hurt a knee with a historic injury. As a consequence, I started using the ATG app to rehabilitate my knee. Since using the ATG app, I'm now able to walk relatively pain-free. I'm not getting any younger, and this knee injury was a lesson that I need to prioritize my physical health and fitness. The ATG app gives you affordable personal training and a coach to help you correct your form on a range of pain-free exercises that build your body from the ground up. ATG's mission is to help the broken to bulletproof their knees and help every person suffering from any degree of knee pain. The founder, Ben Patrick, says he wants to give people back their lives and the ability to play with their children and grandchildren, to give back hope and a renewed invigoration for life. Join me in training on the ATG app. Click on the link to get $20 off the first time and type in code SOPHIA to get a discount on a range of ATG equipment.